In this video, we're going to create this tropical island that includes some advanced techniques for painting island and mountain ranges and biomes with high precision. Surprisingly enough, if you followed my other videos, this is actually a simpler workflow than the previous videos that I've done. So let's jump right in. I'm going to start with an island node, harken back to my original video, and let's just paint some stuff here. Just get a shape in place that doesn't go too much onto the edge, but there's ways we can fix that real easy. Then I'm going to go to Purlin, and we're going to drop to floor. That's going to flatten out, if you notice the difference. It brings it down a little bit. Another way is to clamp and reduce the max until it's, the overall land mass is reasonably above the seafloor. Okay, that looks good. And then I like to do a carver, or actually a blur. We need a blur, because with the island mask, as you could probably tell, it's a steep cliff. It's 90 degrees, and that's just going to be a bear to deal with. So what I do is blur, and it does take away the detail on top, but erosion will put that right back on there, so it's no big deal. And let's turn the blur power up, okay? And then to actually put nice looking cliff faces, we can use Carver. That's a Look Dev, one of these fancy orange ones at the bottom and the middle way. And that just kind of helps with the cliff areas. And then as we start eroding, it's going to do even more. But from this point, I'm going to go zero borders and fix this where it's meeting the edge. We're going to change it to square and bump down the fall off, which, if you can tell, fall off is how far, as you raise fall off, the more it blends toward the center, and we'll just reduce that to the edge, and that's pretty good. Okay, so to do our mountains, what I'm learning about tectonic plates and geology is mountains typically will form, or canyons will form at the joining of, or separating of, two plates. So in fact, we can represent both of those for fun, and the way I do it is I'll use Purlin as just a natural good noise, and then I'll put mask. So mask to Purlin. Let's draw, I'm going to pin zero borders with F, and then go back to mask. And then now what I'm going to do is kind of come cross diagonally. I guess I'm going to just follow this area right here, and I'm just going to draw a line. So that mask tied into Purlin creates this ridge. Now again, we can drop it to floor, and in this case, typically when I'm combining, just a rule of thumb, is whatever the main track is, the main land, if I'm adding features, I'll drag from the main track to the features to make a combine. And that allows for me to screen. Screen is like you're allowing both to coexist. Add is you're stacking one on top of the other. So it's adds a little bit more aggressive. Screen, if you go with blend or max or some of these others, you get other effects. But with screen, you can adjust the ratio of screen to raise or lower your mountain height. Now I'd like it to be a little bit more rugged, so if we turn our scale down on our Purlin, you can see it's more varied, and your seed can move that around even more. That's just a quick mountain range, and then we haven't done any erosion other than the carver just to clean up the coastline. Another thing we can try, I'm doing this shooting from the hip, is canyon. And I'm going to flatten, I'm bring that down to the floor. It doesn't naturally go all the way to the floor because of the depth of the canyon, but we can reduce the depth to make it shallower. And let's see which one it needs to be here. So we've already combined our mountain with our land mass. And now we're going to put a canyon that goes, it looks like it's east-west. So if this is the orientation that matches the 2D, then the canyon crosses over our mountains. And let's go ahead and erode just to see what that takes, what that gives us so far. So I'm going to go and show off Wizard. And with Wizard, I'm going to, for this example, I'll just do a tropical theme. And there is some settings here in Wizard that help with that. There's a Hawaii furrows for phase 2. And we can even bump to 2 pass, which just makes it a little bit more aggressive. And we'll show what that looks like. So it has these deep crevices in the mountain from like a super eroded tropic. And if we're not happy with our canyon, we can screen. Let's see if screen is the one. That's created more of a step situation. Let me increase the depth and reduce the valley. Just see if that. So now there's a canyon that cuts through. That's kind of crazy, but it's almost like the sediment is a little bit too left. Is removed too much. So I'm going to add deposits. And that'll fill that in a little bit. Another one is alluvium. And if we change to deposits and bump up the flow, apply the change, it's given us more sediment, flat areas on the bottom, but it's pulling it away from the cliff to show off the shadows on the cliff face. So this is pretty wild, rugged terrain. It can be taken anywhere from here, but I kind of like this. Let's see how it looks with our sea. And we will bump up, I guess the overall height is higher than regular, so let's bump that up and turn the shore size down and the variation to half. And variation is just varies the amount of beach along the coastline. If you want it to be more even, you can kind of see it pulling back. Okay, we need to go up a little bit more with our level. There we go. And we're pretty much off of the edge of the map. Let's try 18. Okay, that looks pretty good. So it's generally a flat, what I was really hoping to show off with this technique is with island, purlin, clamp, blur, it's generally a flatter area. It's not like it's one hump of a landmass as if you would start with a mountain or a range. And another way to process that is actually to use clip. There's a if I have purlin selected, so here I am at my island and then purlin, maybe it's still too lumpy. And maybe I can go over here as well, because this is after I made some changes. Let's just go ahead to Carver, because that's right before we do zero borders. What you can do if you really want it more flat is do the clip post-process and then bring down the max. You just kind of have to hunt for it. And it flat tops. It completely cuts off that top part of the hill. That way when you add mountains, it's a lot more precise. And then your canyon, and then it gives you that. But obviously if you weren't doing a thing like this, another one just to show quite a different effect is, I'm thinking and chewing gum at the same time. Let's see. Not stacks. It's Yeah, so that's a little bit more of an alpine, normal mountain look. If you didn't want the tropical look, then fold can give you something, and then you can just follow it up with a normal erosion or even a thermal before. And it's a little bit more pillowy, looks like bread dough. But the mountain feature actually is attractive, you know. That would, when I'm thinking of mountains, I'm looking at how the shadows lay across it with the light source. But we're going to run with our tropical fancy one, and it looks like flattening, doing that clip drastically changed the end result because it removed some of the bulk away from our island. So I'm actually going to remove it here, but that is a helpful technique. So I'm going to uncheck clip so we have everything back. And if you don't want stuff there, you can add in, say for example, a hill. Let's just add a hill after we added the canyon. I know it's getting a little crazy here. I'm going to move that forward. Delete this stuff. Bring our hill. That way we're adding our mountains, adding a canyon, and now we're going to add a hill, which I'll probably want to transform. Transform is a way to scale and position using these sliders. And then we'll screen that. So I'm going to hit F on our C node, and we're going to bump up our screen to see. Oh, I see what I did. Transform. Oh, I'm not coming off of the output. I was wondering why I wasn't seeing any effects. So this might be a crazy change. And it is. So let's go back down to half. And bring, there we go. So we're kind of finding a happy medium. We bump that up, it's just filling in the area more. I want to bring it down off the top. And I think that looks fine. So that just gave us more island to work with. So we're not wasting space. But you can see that there's a canyon in there. If you want to go deeper or wider, it'll have all the effects. You just have to have fun with that. Okay, so let's move forward. So in summary, we have a island that we painted ourselves, the shape of the island, and we painted a mountain range, and we put a canyon and even added extra bulk in some areas. And that's just a finesse thing that you have to get used to. So for the biomes, and typically what I'll do as a final post-process is surface, which enhances some of the features like rock protrusion. I'll bump it down, and I don't know a big difference between rock and rough. So we have a reduced surface. If you can tell, it's a subtle at the macro level, but at the ground level it just adds a little bit more detail. And if it's not enough, then we can bump it up, and you can definitely see the difference there. But little difference here means a big thing when you're a little dude on the ground. So I'm going to keep it low. And I also come with micro erosion, which is a micro level change. And here we can actually bump this to 1K. We've been watching it half resolution thus far. Okay. So I'm going to just blend these half and half, output to output, 50% blend. If you can tell that there's a difference. So that may or may not work for the land terrain you're building. So now let's paint some trees. So I'll come off of here with arboreal, and this is where our biomes split. And when I say biome, I'm thinking in terms of arid or wet. That's, to me, is if you had to pick two biomes, that kind of separates them all. So a lush and a dry. And so the default settings for arboreal, and I'll just change this to arboreal lush so I can pick it up later. And then I'll copy paste lush dry. Now the difference in dry is in dry environments, whatever is growing is going to want to go where the water happens to be if it's low rainfall. Now for this technique, I turn the height all the way down, but to go where the water is, you change to seek water, and you'll see that it's in the valleys. It's where water would flow. That's where we have. So this is the arid style. And if you want to turn it down even more, you can reduce the health, but I think that's few enough. Maybe I'm looking at this little area, or this little area over here, and what that might represent based upon the technique that I'm showing later. Okay, so we got trees all underneath the ocean. We can fix that. Here in our C node, there is a C output, which is the second one down, and then there's a beach output, which is the last one. If you drag output to output, and then you add these together, that gives you a mask that's the ocean and the beach. And I'm going to uncheck render water surface, and that's going to reveal our seafloor. But this is a mask that we can use on our arboreal if you want to see how it cuts away trees underneath. Okay, let's make some changes here. I'm going to change the height down. Okay, and as you're getting to know this, you're going to be tempted, I've done it before, go to large and fuzzy, and that makes big blocks of rich forest texture rules. But when you're trying to create a game that's performant and you want it to look full, it's not really practical to have that much coverage of forest. So I've really come to appreciate the small setting, and it looks sparse here, but once you're on the ground and you're seeing things from the side, it actually creates like little pathways, and it's little clumps of forest, and I think it actually improves it. So another thing I want to change, I want to pull the trees down off the ridge line because I don't want to render them in there. So I'm going to change altitude fall off. I'm going to bring that down, and then I'm going to just pare it down while I'm watching that ridge line until, yeah, see there, it's coming off now. Maybe that's a little too much. I don't really want a bald right there. So that's okay right there. And it's all crazy on the cliffs, so let's change our slope fall off and just bring that way down, and that'll pull that back. But there'll be other adjustments later that'll clean that up as well. And if we want it to cover the area a little bit more, you can change flows. Increasing it reduces the amount of trees. Reducing flow increases the coverage. So I think that right there is fine. Okay, so we have our two vegetation rules for each biome. Let's put this together. So I'm going to create some portals that will pull in for the next stage. And I'm using the colorize, which is the third output for arboreal, and that's just the blotches of green. That's all we're concerned with. And we're going to do our sea and our beach, and so we can work with that. There are other outputs as secondary things that you could mess around with, like here's alluvium. Let's take a look at that and level it, and you'll see if you multiply that, it'll give us, that's kind of a nice looking rule. And we can use that when we colorize our RGB masks. Okay, so let's get started. I need to set a height map. I'm going to come out of the last output of my height map. You can rename this, but I'm just kind of getting into the habit of using these FX nodes for handy labels. Okay, so we have our height map. I'm going to make a portal, but I'm also going to mark it for export. I'm just thinking ahead, and we'll revisit that at export time. And then I'll come down here and let's pull that in again. So I'll do another FX portal height map. Looks like I spelled it wrong. One more. We'll have our arboreal dry. And I'm going to move that down because I want, since I'm explaining this, and I want to be able to understand it when I come back to it after a week. I want to stay organized. I'll show you how I do that. So we have arboreal lush at the top, arboreal dry below, and our height map in the middle. So for arboreal, you know, this is fine. On a game scale, these squares are going to be too sharp, so I'm going to throw a blur, just a stock blur, and that fades the forest into that next texture that happens to be wherever. And so if you had followed my other biome tutorial, we were exporting RGBs. You know, some of my videos were exporting splats, and I go into detail in the other biome video why RGBs need to be used based upon how Unity Terrain Tools works. And RGB is a 3-channel mask, red, green, blue. So we need to think in multiples of 3, and I'm going to allow for 3 textures for the lush terrain, 3 textures for the dry terrain, and then I'm going to do 3 textures that are common, such as the beach, and mountain and rock. So we're going to have 3 RGBs, so we're going to have 3 categories that we need to keep organized. So if I keep jungle or the lush at the top, here's our first rule, and that's the trees coverage. And I'll get into the paintable part later. I'm just going to go ahead and establish these rules, and then you'll see it all come together when we start masking it. So my workflow in terms of this, and I guess I need to have more rules set. So for each of the 2 biomes, there's going to be 1 tree rule, arboreal, and then 2 soil rules. And those could be grass or they could be bare earth. If you want a drier desert, then you put dirt there and not grass. That happens in Unity. But we'll put the data rule there for that pattern to exist in the RGB mask. So what we'll do is we'll come off the height map, and I'll come into soil is a data rule that kind of gives us something to work off of. And then another one is the texture. You can actually use that here, and that sets up like this modeling. We're not so concerned about the rock because that's going to have a different rule that's going to be cut away from this. But if you look here in the flat areas, there's this modeling that's will help blend and give interest and break up tiling, and it'll help our result in the end look better. So we have this one, and this one kind of does it. Most of the feature is up on the slope, and that'll actually be cut away as well at a later stage. Because if I'm thinking, I want these rules to be utilized for grass, and I'll think where I want grass to exist in my world. Might move this back a little bit. Okay, so there's 3 rules. That's RGB. We're going to do a lot of other subtraction to redefine it, but I'm going to keep moving and at least get the initial steps in place. So to be consistent, we'll do texture here, This is the arid grouping in soil. Okay, and then for the common rules, I'm going to throw down another FX node and do a portal to Heightmap, if you can see. So we're going to do sand, and this is the common rules. So I'm going to do 2 rock layers, and I'll do a sand layer. And sand will be, we need to bring in our beach stuff, our beach portals. So we have CC, and we have C Beach as our other portal. Okay, so we can combine these right away. It's kind of like we did before as a mask. I could have made a portal off of that. But this represents some of our sand, but the other aspect we can do is a flow node. And I like to use the 1:3 ratio. It just gives it a finer quality. It's not as overpowering. Now, of course, it is overpowering anyway, and I'll show you how to think about subtracting out so that you see flow where it's visible, but it's not polluting the other textures. Okay, so, and this will actually be combined with sand just to simplify and to allow us to do our 2 rock rules. So I'm going to do slope as 1 rock rule. I'm going to change the percentage from 40 to 90. I'm going to reduce the fall off so there's not so much fade. And then we're going to do protrusion. Make sure these are consistent. Might give a little bit extra room down here. Okay, so we have the steep parts above 40 degrees. And this is the protruding parts, but it's also the concave parts. It's not a perfect node, but we can clean it up by bumping up the power, and that'll make it more contrast. And then we'll change the clip minimum for post-process. We'll just bump that up, and that'll cut away the lighter, the fainter values. And then we'll do shaper, which is this one, and we'll go above to where it brightens everything. So we've cut away the white noise, and we're bringing out what's left. We're elevating it so that it can contend with these other rules. So we have our 2 rock rules. We have a flow and our sand, and we have both biomes that are ready for the next stage. If that makes sense. So the next step that helps me stay organized is I'll put a column of multi-combines with the subtract option, because we're going to be subtracting all kinds of things from each other. So it's just the logical thing to have that set up. So I'm going to just put a multi-combine. I'm going to change the method to subtract 100%, kind of move it, and I'm going to assign one of these for each of our layers. Control V, Control C, Control V, Control C. I'm going to copy this, move it down, and paste the other one. If you don't move it out of the way before you paste, it tends to just, I'll show you, it puts it on top. In this case, I can still grab it, but that's a trick if you're needing to duplicate certain things. Okay, and I need one more rule, because since flow is on land, it needs to be processed a little bit differently than the beach, which is everything below land or sea level. So it'll have its own rule set. Alright, so here is the assigned multi-combine for our lush tree. And the first thing we want to subtract is I don't want trees growing where rock is. So if there's a rock rule present, then it needs to cut away the forest in that instance. So if we go down here to slope and protrusion, and a quickie is just to make a mask out of these two. So I've combined slope and protrusion, added them together, and that's set off behind because it's not necessarily going to be used more than this, but it minimizes how much we have to subtract from these others. So here's our combined rock, and it does look like the protrusion is a little bit faint. I'm going to see if I can bump that up. I pared it back because it started filling in the valley, and that's not what I want either. So that's a little bit better. Another way to do it is to add it twice and it'll double it up, but I think it's okay. So if we subtract rock from our arboreal for our lush, that's kind of what we get. You saw the difference, it took away some. And then our texture, our soil rule, we also want to subtract rock from that, but I guess we need to assign it first to a multi-combine. So we're going to subtract rock from that, and that's what we get. Our soil node, our grass 2 node, I'm going to assign it to this multi-combine and subtract rock from that. And by doing this, as all of this is put together in the end, it's not going to all be a blur, like a blended soup. It's actually going to represent in a stronger way in the finished product. Okay, so arboreal dry, we need to put a blur on this. And because there's so much going on, this being organized and methodical with this really helps from having to do multiple dummy iterations from Unity back to Gaea to fix something. So here's arboreal dry. Since it tends to hug the flows, it's probably not going to be affected by rock much, but we can check it out. So it made a small change. And we'll definitely want to, let's go ahead and assign these two. Remove rock from our arid. This is the arid grouping. Soil 1 and soil 2. Okay, so now we can assign our slope, our rock 1, our protrusion is our rock 2, and I can rename these if it helps. It probably will help. So rock 2, rock 1, arid soil 2, arid soil 1. This is arboreal or forest, arid forest. This is lush grass 2, lush grass 1, and forest or lush forest. Okay, and we won't really, we're going to actually combine these two, but just to be consistent in OCD, we'll say flow or sediment, whatever you want to call it, and this is sand. Okay, so let's assign that one to this one to this one, and then start subtracting out. So in terms of the rock, the first thing that I think of is I want the protrusion to be subtracted from the slope. And that'll allow, that'll tone it down a little bit. That way protrusion can speak for itself. And then flow will also take that away. And that cuts away the flow lines from inside. But it's still really noisy. I guess that's the character of our terrain. We can reduce or actually increase the slope angle, which will reduce. See, before it was like 40. bumping that up heightens up the rock. So now it's less prevalent. But rock is rock, and if we didn't like the amount of rock, we could change it in the overall height map. But this is where we're at now, and for protrusion, I'm going to subtract flow from it. I'm debating if I'm going to subtract slope from it. I don't think it's really necessary because we've already subtracted that from that. So I think that's okay. We have our steep and we have our outcroppings. Our flow, so it's dominant. We subtracted it from our rock, but we want our soil, our grass, our forest to overpower it. Otherwise it's going to look too much. So what I'm going to do, I have to increase this so y'all can see. We have forest. This is our arid rules. We're going to subtract all of our finished rules, not the early ones, our finished layers from our flow. And it's going to do too much already, I can see, because we haven't subtracted our sand from this. So let's do that first, just so it's not overwhelming to see the difference. So what I'm trying to say is, let's subtract our sand rule, this one here, from each of the land rules, and that'll give us a more respective representation of what they really are. Okay. Try to do this in one movement. So here's our grass 2 for lush. Lush grass 1. Our lush forest. That just cuts it away off the beach. But we had already made that filter, so it didn't make a big difference. Okay. So now that we have that, let's go back through. Yeah, the flow. So now we will subtract the finished grass and tree rules from our flow so that it's more balanced. So I'm taking the output of the multi-combine and feeding it into this. And you'll just see it pare back more and more and more. I know it looks like little boxes, but hopefully I've explained it. Okay, so we've subtracted all 6 of our biome rules, and you know, it kind of looks destroyed, but if you look on the cliff faces, it actually shows. So where there's not a biome, where it's just rock, that's going to be seen. And all of this stuff underneath the ocean, well, that's going to happen anyway when we add it after here. But let's go ahead and do our sand for our beach. And what all I want to do is subtract the rock. That way, underneath the water, the rock appears. That's really easy. So, subtract our protrusion and subtract our slope. Okay, so now we have our finished sand, our flow. These will combine together. And one little trick is if you subtract flow from the beach, it's actually going to give a tricky pattern. Even though it's the same texture, it's at different weights. And that's just like a way to get free data, or free effects. Okay, I think this puppy is ready to bark. Let's do an RGB. And we'll see how these represent. You know, usually at this stage you can see if anything is blending together in a weird way. We have pretty decent green. It's not super bright. Sometimes you can hit auto level and it'll enhance it. In that case it did. The blue is really bright and the red is bright. There's not a whole lot of blending between the two. So that just means these rules are segregated They're apportioned like in their own space. So if we go to our arid, let's go ahead and do an RGB. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so with grass rules, I typically allow a blending between, in this case it would be green and blue. So it's not super defined, but they just sort of mix and match. Now the tree rule, the arboreal, is showing up as orange, so it's being smothered by something. And I'm not sure, well, I guess it's blue. Does that make red orange? Is blue? I'll have to think about it. Either way, we can probably subtract from our soil 1, which is the brightest, most dominant one. We'll subtract our tree, our arboreal. And that allows that to be a little bit more red. Now it still fades into purple, but I think that's okay. I'm fine with that. So there is our truth for an arid climate. And if you're asking at this time, well, where does the biomes come in if you're just creating 2 rule sets? Well, we're going to mask and be able to paint those biomes wherever we want, and we'll go through that. But let's do our RGB for our lush. Okay, so we have the same thing, like grass 1 needs to have the tree subtracted from it. And now it's a better balance. And if you're not seeing a whole lot of blue, well, we can auto level blue, and that will enhance it if you saw a little bit of difference there. Off and on. And maybe we'll do that over here too, so we'll enhance our blue. Okay, so now we have our biomes, our lush biome, and our arid, and our common. So let's paint some biomes, and it's really quite simple. I introduced it in the first biome tutorial, but this is a more less complex way once you got it down. So each one of these data rules has a second input, and they're all masks. So what a mask is it's only going to apply it, or it's either going to apply it or it's not going to apply it. It depends on how you use it. But if we put a mask on each of these rules, then it's only going to apply these rules where that mask is. So let's just do it. So what I'm looking for is the mask node, and that's another one like Island where you get to paint. And I'm going to go into edit mode, but for me to be able to do this accurately, I'm going to go back to our C node, because it shows the coastline. I'm going to hit F to pin it. So now that I go into here in the mask, I'm going to make this smaller for right now. And we edit it, it puts you up into this 2D view. This is where you work. Now we can paint. So there is a fascinating channel on YouTube that I encourage y'all, if you want to make a semi-realistic world or just need help deciding what to do with your world, well, you can actually follow the way geology and the world's put together, how biomes naturally form. Here in YouTube, there's this channel, Artifaction, and he breaks it down. He's a charming Scottish fellow, and he breaks down how the world works, how the rotation of the earth and creates air currents, and how tectonic plates create mountains. It's really fascinating. But in a nutshell, if you think about how the continents are, all of the major continents on the east coast is like a subtropic. It's a wetter climate. It's denser vegetation. So the eastern seaboard, Appalachian, there's the Amazon rainforest, and I'm sure Eastern Asia and Africa are the same way. And I think even Australia is, even though it's mostly dry. And that is down that eastern seaboard. And I'm going to the mountain ridge. I'm painting down the mountain ridge. And I'm just painting my lush biome. You don't have to be super clean with this because the biomes only apply to land, the way that we've set them up. So now this whole area within this quadrant is going to be the lush biome. And if we go back to thinking about how continents are on the western seaboard, it's a Mediterranean. It's a little bit drier, but still mild. If you think about the western coast, you know, California or Spain, and maybe Peru, there's still vegetation, but it's not as wet and humid as the eastern side. So what I can do there, and I'm gonna go up the top edge to connect, but I'm not going to go as deep. I'm not going to the ridge line. I'm just going to stay kind of close to the coast. And there may be more nuance that I need to get, but that's a quick way to figure out. And that way the center is more or less the dry. So to do the rest, we don't have to paint the rest. All we have to do is on our mask, and let's hook this up real quick for instant gratification. So mask, lush, soil, and I'm still pinned, so I'm going to pin this and then unpin it so I'm not locked to it. You'll see that's where we painted. That's where the lush biome is. It's kind of colorful. To do the rest, we come off of our mask down to here to an invert, and that gives us everything else. And we'll hook that up to our arid climate. And see how that looks. So that's in the dry. Kind of looks like someone jumping for joy. Because yeah, we can paint our biomes, and it's really powerful having it in the height map. It's not like a construct within Unity that has an overhead like Vegetation Studio Biomes. It's already baked in, so I think it's pretty neat. And the amount of detail that you can go into, you can draw a big happy face really easy. So here's our common, and you may think, well, do we need to subtract from here? And the truth is, we don't, because if you see the black, and it's more black than it appears, but I would probably, maybe it's a good idea to change the amount of rock that's here. But it's a tropical climate, so it's heavy on the features. But everywhere that's black, that's where our thing can show. And a quick way to kind of spy on it and see is you can actually combine RGBs. So if we combine the arid and the common, you can see that it fills in the black. There's still black along the coastline. That would be the lush environment. So it's going to work better than you may think. So I'm going to mark these for export. We're going to go into Unity and put this together. And we already have our height map. So height map will be raw, common, PNG, arid PNG, lush PNG. These are the other settings. We'll build this. Okay, I'm going to come right back into Unity, and we'll put this together. Okay, we're back in Unity, and I have a new scene here. We have a ocean, and the Aqua's Light free ocean is a really good one. So if you need an ocean, I'm using Unistorm Weather, and Vegetation Studio regular version. So first let's create our height map. I'm going to go to Terrain Toolbox, and if you haven't used it before, it's in the Unity registry. It's a package that you install, and that creates this Terrain Toolbox. And on the Create New Terrain tab, I'm going to use these settings. This is half world space from Gaea, which presumes 5K by 5K, but I'm cutting that in half with a 1300 height. That allows me, well, it's going to shrink the island 4 times, but it's also going to allow me to have a little bit more detail as I'm shrinking it. So if I don't need a huge island, I can actually get a little bit extra bonus from bumping up the resolution as I import. And we're going to choose the file. So it's a raw file. Seems this is version 4 apparently. And we're flipping on the vertical axis. Okay, there we go. Zoom in here. It looks like our overall height is higher than normal. It's probably because of the canyon. It bumped everything up. So I'm going to raise my water plane. We'll go back to Inspector and raise the water. And I can't really tell yet. It helps once it's painted. I can see the beach shelf, but once it's painted you can see the sea floor just fine. So let's go to our terrain and paint texture. And I actually have, I'm going to save this, I actually have a palette already pre-made. These are tropical colors and textures. And the order that you have these textures needs to match the order that you're going to load the splat maps. And in my head, I've had a standard of where I do the lush tropical forest first. So the top 3 textures are for the tropical, the lush biome. Then I go with arid, so the next 3 are for arid. And then I go to the common, so the next 3 are common. One of these is extra, so I'll put it as the 4th. But since we're going to be using Terrain Toolbox, it's expecting splat maps and multiples of 4. So we have to add throwaway textures to add that alpha channel that once we destroy it, it'll remove that extra channel that doesn't have any information in it. And what I'm doing here is, so I just put a ground mud, it's a throwaway texture on the 4th slot, and then I'm going to do cavern in the 8th slot, and then that one straggler is going to be bumped down to the 12th slot. So now that we have our, I think sand needs to be the 3rd one down. So now that we have those, I'm going to go back to Terrain Toolbox, click on Terrain Utilities, Import from Terrain, there it loads everything. And then I'm going to click Import from Selected Terrain, and it'll go ahead and create 3 slots to receive splat maps. So jungle first, or lush, and then arid, and common. I'm going to click Apply to Terrain, and there we go. It's not quite there because we have these extra layers that are masking everything. I'm going to check all 3 of those and choose Remove Selected Layers. And there it is. Now I chose a darker stone, presuming it's a volcanic island like Hawaii, and swapping those out changes it. And if you want the effect of that I have here, where there's a darker and a lighter, it's the same texture. This is limestone, that's my favorite. And I just do a light, a dark, a medium, a super dark versions, and I have layers for each. And that allows me to colorize the terrain. But this is a good texture for the way that the normals and the height map, when it's brought into PBR, like microsplat, height-based blending. But what we did here, just for a moment, is there's actually 3 textures going on here, because we have our sand, we have our 2 rock. So there's a lot of color contrast and shadow contrast happening on this mountainside, and I just think that goes beyond what you typically see. We need to raise our sea floor because we're seeing too much of our beach peek through. So I'm just going to bring that up to a decent sized little beach. And let's see if we can witness from above where our tropical terrain is, and there it is. You can see it's much greener, and this is intentionally more mineral. It's less ground cover. And if in the mask in Gaea, here I'll flip back over real quick. I have it open. If you want the blending to be more gradual, you just on the mask that we painted, you just increase or decrease the power, and that'll sharpen or blur that transition. So that's another tip. Okay, so now I'm going to show, I had introduced it in the first biome tutorial how to actually put the trees on here. And what I had used since the beginning now is Vegetation Studio. I have the Pro, but you don't need the Pro. The regular one works fine for this. I am working on an asset that's more specific to this technique, but in lieu of that not being quite ready, I'll show you what I did here. So this, I already have a package installed. I'm going to presume that you can find out how to use Vegetation Studio on your own, just to keep this video brief. But I have a package, and it looks like I need to set a water level real quick. It's 235, maybe 236. So we're going to set the sea floor to 236, and that just doesn't print grass underneath the ocean, underneath the water. And the basic setup, since we had painted our terrain with a texture for grass, grass 2, and our trees, what I've done here is, let's just simplify it. So these are the grass textures that I'm going to show on the terrain. But what I'm using are the terrain texture rules. Since the rules are already printed on the terrain, we can filter where grass occurs. We don't have to do a whole lot of work to paint it. We just grab those textures. In this case, for grass, I'm actually excluding rock and sand and the trees for this particular one. They're different for each one. But that's another way. With Vegetation Studio, you can use include texture rules or exclude texture rules to move things where you are. And another tip that's turned out to be pretty handy is to have your forest be the first, your most vegetation dense or complex by layer to be the first one. That way, when you're adding these add rules, so say for example this rock clump, if I only want it to be in the lush forest, then I can do include texture rule, add a new rule, and it's right there. It's already selected, 0.1. Maybe you want to change it has to be half density, half power texture or greater. But that's really the simplicity of it. And from that, you can get something that looks really nice. Now, obviously, learning the nuance of balancing vegetation to give semi-performance, that's just something you're going to have to invest time in, just like with Gaea. But that's the basis of how powerful Gaea can be. It does a lot of work for you, and you can go back and change the nodes around, and you can recreate all kinds of different worlds with this. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll be back with I might do a video on actually printing the vegetation and just show that process for any of those that are new to Unity and Vegetation Studio. But I won't do that here, and so I hope this was helpful. Have a great day.